Yo. She offered him $30,000 in cash, and he handed it back without a word. That was the story people told in Harbor Cove for years afterward. How Declan Morrow, who could barely keep the heat on through February, handed back a check that would have changed everything. And how the woman who wrote it couldn't figure out whether to be furious or fascinated. Uncle Declan was 41 years old and lived in a gray clapboard house at the edge of town, close enough to the water that you could hear the boats knocking against the dock at night. He'd inherited the house from his father, along with a small boat repair shop that sat beside it. Paint peeling off the sign, the parking lot more gravel than pavement. He'd also inherited his father's stubbornness, which most people in Harbor Cove considered both his greatest quality and his most maddening flaw. His wife, Claire, had died 3 years earlier from an illness that moved too fast for anyone to keep up with. She was 38. Their daughter, Wren, had just turned 6 when it happened. Now Wren was 9. Gap-toothed and serious, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's habit of going quiet when something was bothering her. Every morning, Declan got up at 5 to open the shop before the fishing boats came back in. He packed Wren's lunch before she woke up. Always a ham sandwich on whole wheat, an apple, a little bag of crackers. She'd eat one at a time, very deliberately, like she was solving a puzzle. He dropped her at school on his way back from the docks. He picked her up at 3:15, made dinner, helped with homework, read to her if she wanted, sat at the kitchen table after she fell asleep, going through the accounts with a pencil and a growing sense of dread. The shop had been struggling for 2 years. Not because Declan didn't know boats. He did, better than almost anyone in the province, but because the bigger marinas up the coast had newer equipment and lower prices, and one by one the commercial clients had drifted away. What was left were locals, old-timers, people who came to Declan because they'd gone to his father before him, because they trusted the name. It was enough to stay afloat, barely. But barely had a way of slipping. He'd gotten a second mortgage to replace a critical piece of equipment the previous spring. He hadn't told anyone. The woman who arrived on a Tuesday in October drove a silver vehicle that looked out of place on the gravel road leading to the shop. She parked, stepped out, and stood looking at the building for a moment before walking over. She was dressed in a charcoal blazer and dark trousers, the kind of outfit that suggested she made decisions for a living. Her name was Sylvia Crane. She was the regional director of Crane Marine Development, a company that had been quietly buying up waterfront properties along the coast for the past 18 months. Declan knew who she was before she introduced herself. Harbor Cove was a small town. "Mr. Morrow," she said, extending a hand. "Declan." He shook it. He had engine grease on his fingers and didn't apologize for it. She explained the proposal directly, which he respected. The company wanted the property, the house, the shop, the dock, as part of a planned expansion of their marine services operation. The offer was generous, more than generous. It was the kind of number that, if he sat with it long enough, would start to feel like a solution. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking out at the water. What would happen to the shop, he asked. Sylvia Crane was honest about that too. The building would likely come down. The operation they were planning was different in scale and scope. Declan nodded slowly. Then he took the folder she'd brought, the summary of terms, the letter of intent, the preliminary offer, and handed it back to her. "I appreciate you coming out," he said. "The answer's no." She frowned, but it wasn't an offended frown. It was more like she was recalibrating. "You haven't had time to review the figures. I don't need to." He said it without heat. "This shop has been in my family for 40 years. My daughter's going to grow up knowing what it looks like. That's not something I'm selling." Sylvia Crane stood on the gravel for a moment, the folder in her hands. Nobody had ever given it back to her. In her experience, everyone had a number. She'd just never met someone who didn't believe that. She said she understood, thanked him for his time, and got back in her car. She came back the following Tuesday. This time, she didn't bring paperwork. She said she was in the area for another meeting and stopped on impulse, which Declan didn't entirely believe but didn't challenge. He was replacing the fuel injector on an older trawler, and she stood on the dock watching him work, asking questions about the boat that were more specific than he expected. Turned out her grandfather had been a commercial fisherman in Nova Scotia. She'd grown up around boats before she grew up around boardrooms. He made coffee on the little camp stove in the back of the shop. They sat on overturned crates, and she asked how long he'd been running the place. He told her about his father, about learning to caulk a hull at 12 years old, about taking over when his father's hands started to go. About Claire. He didn't talk about Claire often, but something about the directness of the conversation made it feel natural. Sylvia didn't offer condolences in the way people usually did. The careful, over-gentle way that always made him feel like he was handling something fragile. She just said, "That's a hard thing to carry," and left it there. He found that easier to sit with. Wren came by after school that day. She came most days, doing her homework on the old wooden table in the corner of the shop while Declan worked. She looked at Sylvia with the particular assessment of a 9-year-old who has learned that adults often disappoint. "Are you buying our shop?" Wren asked. Sylvia glanced at Declan, then back at Wren. "No," she said. "Your dad said no." Wren considered that. "Good," she said, and went back to her math sheet. Sylvia laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her. Declan noticed it was different from how she'd been before. More open somehow, like a window pushed up. She started coming by more often after that. She told herself it was because she was coordinating logistics for the other properties, and the road past Declan's shop was simply on the route. That was true. It wasn't the whole truth. Declan noticed. He wasn't oblivious, and he wasn't the kind of man who needed things spelled out. But he also wasn't in any hurry. He'd stopped being in a hurry about certain things after Claire. Life had a way of arriving before you were ready. And he'd learned to let it move at its own pace. What he noticed was that Wren had started leaving space in the shop corner for a second chair. There was a Wednesday in November when the heat pump in the house stopped working. Declan spent 2 evenings trying to fix it himself, and conceded on the third that he was going to have to call someone. The quote came in at $1,900 he didn't have without putting it on the card. He didn't sleep well that week. He made Wren hot chocolate every night before bed and told her it was a special treat. She gave him the look that meant she knew something was wrong, but wasn't going to push. Sylvia found out the way she found out most things in Harbor Cove. Someone mentioned it in passing. There were no secrets in a town that small. She called Declan that evening. She didn't offer to pay the bill. She knew him well enough by then to understand that would end the conversation. Instead, she said she knew the HVAC company 2 towns over, had worked with them on a commercial project, and could make a call to see if they had a cancellation, or could move him up the list. Would that be all right? He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "That'd be all right." The work got done that Friday at the same price, but faster. He paid for it himself. She never raised it again. There was something in that exchange that mattered more than either of them said out loud. She hadn't tried to fix his problem with money. She'd used what she actually had. A phone call, a relationship, a bit of leverage on his behalf, without taking anything away from him in the process. He thought about it a lot in the weeks after. About the difference between charity and that. December arrived gray and cold, and Harbor Cove settled into the particular quietness of a coastal winter. The shop was slower. Declan took on some carpentry work to make up the difference. Nothing glamorous, but he was good with his hands and the money helped. One evening Sylvia stayed for dinner. It happened gradually enough that nobody quite decided it. Wren had been telling her about a school project involving the history of the local fishing industry, and Sylvia had started explaining something about shipping routes. And then Declan said there was enough soup if she wanted to stay, and she said yes before she'd really thought it through. After Wren went to bed, they sat at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee. The house was quiet. You could hear the wind coming off the water. "Can I ask you something?" Sylvia said. "Probably. When I came out here in October. When you handed back the folder." She paused. "Were you scared?" He considered that. "Of course I was. But you still said no." "Scared doesn't mean wrong," he said. "If I sold this place because I was scared, that fear would follow me wherever I went. The shop's not what's holding us here. It's that Wren needs to know some things don't disappear. Her mother disappeared. Her grandfather disappeared. Some things have to stay." Sylvia was quiet for a while. Outside, the wind moved through the birch trees along the property line. "I've been doing this job for 11 years, she said. "I've bought 73 properties. I've never had anyone hand me back the folder before. First time for everything." She looked at him. "Why does that not surprise you to say?" "Because I wasn't handing it back to you," he said. "I was handing it back to the job. You're not the same as the job." That distinction settled between them, and neither of them moved to fill it. She left around 10. Headlights sweeping the gravel as she turned out of the drive. Declan stood on the porch for a moment in the cold and watched the red taillights disappear around the bend. The town had opinions, naturally. Harbor Cove was the kind of place that noticed everything and said most of it. Declan's neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Fran Doyle who lived across the road with her husband and an extremely opinionated cat, stopped him one afternoon to ask with characteristic bluntness whether he was seeing that woman from the development company. "I'm not sure what we're doing," Declan said honestly. Fran considered this. "Well," she said, "just make sure Wren's all right with whatever it is." That conversation stuck with him. He talked to Wren about it the following Saturday, not in any formal way. He wasn't a formal conversation kind of father. But while they were doing the dishes after breakfast, with the radio on low and the morning light coming in flat and white off the water, he said Sylvia had been coming around a fair bit and asked Wren what she thought of that. Wren dried a mug with careful attention. "She talks to me like I'm a person," she said. Declan waited. "Some grown-ups talk to kids like we're kind of in the way," Wren said. "She doesn't do that." He nodded. "Also, she knew about the tides," Wren said, as though this settled the matter. "That was January. By February things were clearer, in the way that things become clear in winter, slowly. By the removal of everything unnecessary, they weren't formal about it. There were no announcements, no declarations. There were dinners. And Saturdays, and Wren explaining the rules of a game she'd invented, that seemed to have about 40 components and change weekly, and Sylvia keeping up with it better than most adults would have tried. There was an evening when Sylvia was helping Wren with a school project about local ecosystems, and Wren, without looking up from her paper, said, "You could just stay over if it's getting late." Declan and Sylvia looked at each other across the table. Wren continued cutting out pictures of tidal pools. "She's something," Sylvia said later. "She is," Declan agreed. Spring came slowly to Harbor Cove, the way it always did, the ice going out a little at a time. The shop picked up. One of the commercial clients came back, a small fleet operator who'd tried the bigger marina and hadn't been happy with the turnaround time. Then another. Word spread the way it does in small coastal towns, through the docks and the coffee shop and the back and forth of fishermen who value trust over convenience. Sylvia had made a few calls. She didn't advertise this. She'd mentioned the shop to a few people she knew in the industry, not as a favor, she told herself, but because the work genuinely was good and people who needed boat repair deserved to know about it. Declan found out third hand, the way he found out most things in this town. He waited until the right moment to mention it. They were walking along the breakwater with Wren running ahead, the May air still carrying a bite off the water. "Heard you've been talking about the shop," he said. Sylvia kept walking. "I mentioned it to a few people. I can get my own clients. I know you can." She looked at him. "I didn't pay anyone. I didn't write any checks. I just said it was good work. Is that all right?" He thought about it. "Yeah," he said. "That's all right." It was the same thing he'd said about the heat pump. She noticed. In June, on a Saturday, Sylvia's father came to town. His name was Peter Crane, 72 years old, and he was exactly what Sylvia had described. An old fisherman who'd built his fortune by paying close attention and knowing when to let something go. He drove himself out from Halifax, arrived unannounced, and spent about 45 minutes looking around the shop before he let Declan know he had opinions. "You're underselling the fiberglass work," Peter said. "There's a market for custom restoration that you're not tapping. The heritage boat people, they've got money and they want craft, not volume." Declan looked at him. "Just an observation," Peter said mildly. They argued about it pleasantly for an hour. Sylvia sat in the corner where Wren usually did her homework, watching her father talk boats with the first man she'd met in years, who gave her his honest opinion without checking first to see what she wanted to hear. Later, walking to his car, Peter fell back a half step so Wren moved ahead, and he and Declan were briefly side by side. "She's different since she started coming here," Peter said quietly. "In what way?" Peter thought about it, like she remembered something she'd forgotten. He shook his head slightly. "She's been running that company for so long she started thinking that's all there was to her." He glanced back toward the shop. "You didn't treat her like a CEO." "She's not to me," Declan said. Peter looked at him for a moment. "No," he said. "I can see that." He got in his car, rolled down the window. "The fiberglass work, think about it." Wren appeared beside Declan and watched the car pull out. "I liked him," she said. "So did I," Declan said. That summer had a different quality than the ones before it. The shop was steadier. Declan slept better. Wren started sailing lessons at the club 2 towns over, which she approached with the same methodical seriousness she'd brought to everything. Sylvia drove her out on Wednesday evenings when Declan's hours at the shop ran long, and they'd stop for takeout pho on the way back and eat it at the kitchen table, while Wren gave a detailed account of everything she'd learned. None of it looked like what Declan had imagined when he'd thought about his life going forward. He hadn't imagined any of it really. After Claire, he'd stopped imagining. He'd just moved from one task to the next and trusted that the accumulation of small things, the lunches packed, the invoices filed, the homework checked, the boats returned running properly, would eventually add up to something he could call a life. He hadn't expected the something to walk down his gravel road in a charcoal blazer with a folder of terms he was going to hand back. He hadn't expected to find out that the person carrying that folder had her grandfather's knowledge of the tides in her hands, and her father's directness in her voice, and that the combination of those things would slowly become the most comfortable thing in his world outside of his daughter. And the smell of marine varnish on a clear morning. In late August, on a Sunday, they were all out on the dock: Declan, Sylvia, Wren, and Fran Doyle's husband Ray, who had come over ostensibly to return a borrowed socket set but had stayed in the way Ray always stayed, until there was food involved. Wren was teaching Sylvia the game with the 40 components, which had evolved since winter and now apparently incorporated a points system involving the tides. Ray leaned over to Declan and said, in his quiet way, "Your dad would have liked her." Declan looked out at the water. The late afternoon light was going gold off the harbor, the boat sitting easy on the swell. "Yeah," he said. "He would have." He looked at Wren, cross-legged on the dock, explaining a rule with great seriousness while Sylvia listened with her whole attention. He looked at the shop behind them, the gray clapboard and the new sign he'd finally gotten around to painting, his father's name still on it alongside his own. There was no ceremony to mark the moment, no announcement, no grand gesture, just an ordinary Sunday in August on a dock in Harbour Cove, Nova Scotia, the water making its oldest sounds against the pilings, and Declan Morrow realizing, somewhere in the quiet between one breath and the next, that the thing he'd been afraid to want had already arrived without asking permission. Some things, it turned out, didn't need a door, they just came in with the tide, slow and steady and completely certain of themselves, and by the time you noticed, they'd already made themselves at home.